Hello, friendly alumni. You are listening to From Here Forward, an award-winning UBC Podcast Network podcast. I'm Carol.
And I'm Jeevan.
Today, we're talking about gender and innovation. But before we get there, do you have any favorite female-founded or female-owned Canadian businesses, Jeevan?
Ooh, okay, this is a fun question. A local pick, I'm actually a big fan of Bloom Skincare, Punjabi-owned business founded by two sisters from the Metro Vancouver area, which is very lovely. What about you?
I've got two as a dog mom. Stranger Tales. They have some really good hands-free long leashes, also from Metro Van. Very cool. And Dexy Paws. They are Ontario-based, but iconic female-owned. Love them.
Okay, I'm adding these both to my list. Those both sound great. It's 2026, and some people might assume that the gender balance in the entrepreneurial space is relatively close or on par. If you scroll through social media or look at those business lists of the leading pioneers, it looks like an equal number of women and men.
And I was definitely one of those people, when I see those 30 under 30 lists that feature young entrepreneurs, I'm for sure thinking it's 50-50. Even my algorithm features many women entrepreneurs with cool businesses that I want to support.
But Carol and I learned that the stats actually tell a slightly different story. We talked to Dr. Angèle Beausoleil, an assistant professor at the UBC Sauder School of Business. She's also the academic director of the UBC's Maurice Young Center for Entrepreneur and Venture Capital Research. She recently wrote a chapter about gender and innovation in the Encyclopedia of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Spirituality. If you'd like to read it, we'll link it in the show notes.
It was an insightful conversation about how, despite diverse identities participating in historically male-dominant industries, these spaces are still gendered, often having masculinity embedded into them. So we hope you enjoy. Can you please introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
I am Dr. Angèle Beausoleil, and I am an assistant professor, part of the educational leadership team focused on entrepreneurship and innovation at UBC Sauder School of Business.
And today we're going to talk a bit about your work around gender and innovation. But to start, it would be great to hear a bit about what drove that research interest for you.
So I'm what we say in industry and academia, I'm called a pracademic. And the reason for this crazy term is that I actually spent over 20 years in industry before deciding later in life to go and get a PhD. And so part of the motivation of this research, and also simply wanting to dig a bit deeper in terms of innovation experiences, experiments, leadership, and outcomes, was omnipresent. It was a place in which I worked when I was in industry as a consultant, as a new product designer and developer, and as a serial entrepreneur. And the system's very broken. It's broken in many levels. The one problem and issue that I was so motivated to research more deeply was really understanding our lack of literacy around how innovation really happens and who actually participates in this innovation process inside organizations, and can those be improved? And essentially, I saw a lot of what I would call innovation theater, a lot of companies saying, we need to be innovative, but not necessarily thinking, do we have the right systems in place? Do we have the right people in place? And can we genuinely innovate and or improve product, service, a process so that the public or the consumer benefits? It's very broken, very uneven. And so there was this persistent cycle of bad leadership, making decisions that were shareholder driven as opposed to stakeholder or consumer driven, and the need to innovate based on performative approaches as opposed to genuine improvement and change. And so I set forth to go, there must be a better recipe or formula to innovate. And that led me to pursue a PhD and to really understand what we call in entrepreneurship land, where the human in the loop really should be and how best can we have broader representation in that loop.
That sounds really cool. I love hearing when professionals have a whole career and then they go to pursue a PhD. I feel like it really adds nuance to that research in ways that the flip side doesn't always produce. So your most recent chapter about gender and innovation, the title itself, very interesting. As someone who doesn't really know much about business, I was like, is innovation too masculine? What does that mean?
Well, I do love to ask a lot of questions. It's probably why I landed and became an academic and an educational leader. Asking the question is first and foremost so important. We need to ask those questions that may not be popular, may even institute a bit of friction. It is meant to be provocative. So the idea is it masculine? First and foremost, you question what? Like, is innovation gendered to begin with? And why are we calling it masculine over anything else? And so that was meant to be provocative, but also to surface years of research in terms of a gender gap in innovation processes, experiments inside organizations, and also question our entrepreneurial ecosystems, our innovation ecosystems. So by asking, is it too masculine? It immediately makes us question, if I look around, can we visibly see it? Can we sense it? Can we see it in roles? Do we see it in terms of ethics and morality? And so it immediately just sparks us to be a little more attuned, to become more observant. Is it male dominated? Is it masculine in terms of traits? And so that was really a provocative question to then begin a conversation on, and then to go, if it's too masculine, that means we have an orientation perhaps towards masculine coded traits, masculine terminology. What does that actually signal? And is it inviting or is it actually exclusive? So that really surfaced a lot of questions in and around what does masculinity mean in the role of innovation? And then do we have evidence to suggest there could be an orientation towards? And there is. And a significant orientation would be, for example, the most recent stats is that 90% of inventors, even in Canada, are male. That's a stat. That's a data point.
Like 90?
Yes, just between 88 and 90.
Wow.
And even when, it's significant. When we just look at that male-oriented versus female, even with founders and female leaders, we are still looking between 17 and 19% of those are leaders in Canadian small, medium-sized companies and organizations. That's a small number.
That's really surprising because I feel like when I'm doing a quick scan of headlines or social media, things of women-owned business, women founders, it seems like there's so much more than I've ever seen. But clearly, statistically, we still haven't made that much progress than what we think we have. Would you say that's correct?
Yes, and absolutely. And highlight a shocking stat would be women entrepreneurs receive less than 5% of venture funding funds over their male counterparts. That's staggering. So we have some work to do.
That's a crazy stat. If we could just rewind quickly, could you talk more about the historic intersections between gender and innovation, just since we've covered so much already?
Yes. And I'd say I'm really just scratching the surface on this research. And I've arrived again as a practitioner, as a female entrepreneur, and as a woman innovator. So I do have a different set of lived experiences and perspectives. And I'd say of those theoretical frameworks, the practices we see in industry, there are always these constructs that we constantly question, which is biology or socially constructed. We can't help it. We go, how much of this is essentially what are we born with? What are we born into? And what are these cultural and social norms we fall into and or follow? And so it's complicated, obviously. So it seems that a lot of the research, again, I'm leaning heavily on those who've studied it deeply, is there's always this intersection. I think too many times we want to polarize, is it this or that? But actually it's really where they intersect, where the rich information, the data, and the norms really surface. And this is where biologically, women do have a set of hormones that are biologically different than their male counterparts. Then there's, of course, the more impactful aspect, which is what we sometimes call the evolutionary psychology, the behavior. So how do we behave with our biology in a circumstance over time? And we have, based on that probably initial biology, we have been in a position to be more of that caregiver. That's because we've signaled perhaps in our physiology, we behave a certain way. And then society and through evolutionary psychology and our behavior, we behave in a sense of we are relationship oriented. We are someone who seeks community as a gender. So there are these traits and norms that have been, I'd say, coupled with the fact that we have very basic sort of biology. But I'd say those two in the greater context of really society is where we truly see the norms, the roles, and why we are having this conversation today in terms of this massive gender gap in innovation is that we have been perpetuating this norm that for the most part, women are caregivers and male need to be providers. And that norm, of course, has been hopefully shattered. At least we've got some fissures along the way in terms of no, it's not a gender divide, but it is what society has deemed and has identified. So for the years, even when the first notion of an entrepreneur, this came from British economists, would actually describe a male construct, right? So what we call the heroic innovator is often described as a male, very risk-oriented, who has the confidence. Sometimes we'd say overconfidence, but would have the confidence and would be able to secure resources. And those resources would then lead to the ability to then, of course, create an enterprise and build an enterprise and then hire others that they could then generate personal wealth, bring it home, and then create community. So these are deeply societal norms that suggest that leader, someone who is to build, launch an enterprise, happens to be more of a male archetype as opposed to a female or matriarch. And so over time, we see that being repeated. And we associate traits such as this ability to be very confident, perceived as bold. We have terms like grit. We have these terms that seem very competitive that are surfaced and what we call masculine coded themes in research, as opposed to the maybe perceived as soft, although not, just different. The competitive as opposed to cooperative, the ability to actually engage in different points of view as opposed to being driven to an outcome. And so societally, we have accepted and are likely also supporting that whether we are aware of it or not, whether we are women in the entrepreneurial process or innovation system, we support it, whether we're aware of it or not, that those norms are kind of expected. And so when we see or even type in, and I love doing this in terms of Gen AI, where are the biases? And so there's gender biases everywhere in terms of we expect to see a male. And we expect to see, particularly, especially at UBC with our scientific community, there is a notion of a particular archetype, male, likely in a lab coat, so on and so forth. And that's been part of our mythology, which is interesting. It is a mythology. So we can question it, we can build, and we can maybe start changing a bit of that mythology, but we do need to know that it exists. And I think that's where the question really comes in. Let's just ask, does it exist? How does it exist? Why does it exist? Can we possibly change it?
I'm curious about what happens when we don't acknowledge this risk. Folks maybe aren't even comfortable with the idea that that's a bias that exists. What are the risks, not only culturally, but for organizations and companies who are maybe ignorant to the idea of a gender bias in corporate spaces and particularly within innovation?
There are several risks. Maybe I'll start with what are the pros? And I'd say we could see if we do not identify that gender difference or maybe missing a few different perspectives at the table, we tend to observe a sense of consensus and alignment. There's a sense of a unilateral view, and that's frictionless. Oh, we love frictionless. So there is a positive orientation to say, let's all align or gain consensus, move forward with a decision so we can begin the implementation process leading to outcome. On the surface, doesn't that sound lovely? But in reality, to your specific question around risks, is that scenario is often called groupthink. Groupthink surfaces a lot of risks. So a problem is presented. You're saying, this is the problem. Let's go actually solve it, as opposed to different perspectives in the room, be it different genders and different cultural and lived experiences. Question, is this the right problem? Are we actually approaching the problem the right way? Who's really the problem owner? Do we understand their needs? Do we need to do more research? Those questions are not asked. And the risks of not asking those questions and not having different points of view is you make quick decisions with a very limited data set and very limited and restrictive points of view. So it means on average, again, very well studied, that very poor decisions are made when you are not inviting those that are perceived to be dissenters And historically, we have seen horrible decisions, let alone modern ones right now, where you do not have anyone in the room or giving you advice in terms of perhaps there are better ways of approaching, for example, a situation that might involve residential schools years ago, or decisions in terms of the US of Bay of Pigs or the war in Iran today, or lacking judgment and morality, raising those questions around Gen AI algorithmic biases. So the risks far outweigh the benefits when it comes to having a groupthink or those that are so aligned that there's no one there to provide a question, provoke conversation, and seek better outcomes.
What are some examples of market disrupting innovations that have been developed or marketed as a result of women contributions, women entrepreneurs, and their ideas?
So we see women across multiple domains. I know often we think that this is because innovation happens to be so closely intertwined with technologies over the centuries, especially from industrial era of, building machines or technologies. And so we do tend to associate innovation with, I'd say, engineering orientation. So we have incredible scientists and inventors who have led new therapeutic solutions. And I know that there's a young two co-founders who launched Chinook as a set of therapies and processes to detect essentially kidney concerns. So they've gone on and they've been acquired and they're starting a new startup. So there are many, many examples, even at UBC, in terms of co-founders. There's young co-founders that are just freshly minted PhD students who have been part of the innovation and pitch competition at UBC. And they're launching and using Gen AI and machine learning to really understand how to detect early issues with seeds that are going to the vertical farms, to essentially a set of farming communities in British Columbia, and also commercial farms. And they're able to detect at the very granular level whether or not that seed will ultimately turn into a healthy plant, et cetera. And those are two co-founding. Of course, we have examples in the food kit. I believe a Canadian launched Cook It. I forget her name. She launched one of the first meal kits. And we only hear perhaps about other founders with a masculine name and that they're launching, whether it's in the food industry, in agri-tech, in medical and lab tech, and even fintech. We have our Dragon's Den, the women that sit on that, it's actually 2 or 3 of them. They've all done some really great innovations in different domains: food and beverage, marketing and finance, and of course, online and digital. So I think we do see a lot of women leadership and women innovators across multiple domains. There's still going to be that 80-20 at the very least that presents itself in terms of what are the real numbers in terms of those making impact. And typically we see those leaders, the innovators, the entrepreneurs that are scaling and growing at a rate, a lot more media attention than, for example, a percentage of new immigrant female founders launching bakeries out of their kitchen, sewing entire online communities from their home office. So the scale is very different. And I'd say, if anything, it's because they're so distributed across communities, across categories. You don't have the same impact and influence, if you will. So, of course, we have an incredible community of female innovators. They're not necessarily seeking the spotlight. They're not necessarily being invited to share their story. They're not necessarily driven or motivated to grow and scale their company to benefit private equity firms.
And so looking forward, what are some of the ways that organizations, companies can start these conversations and begin to ensure that a diverse range of voices and perspectives are heard in relation to new innovations? I know that's a huge question, and I'm sure it's the big issue of your research, but what's the starting point? Like, where do we begin?
So the starting point, and I firmly believe this, is that we work within and leverage our superpowers as we have them. And so I think don't shy away, don't develop more masculine traits to get ahead. And I know if we've gone through the 80s and 90s, it's very much was where I was going in terms of my entrepreneurial ventures. And I think, okay, now it's just really surfaced the talents and maybe those societal norms that have been handed to us. So if we are biologically and of course more socially caregiving and we are about relationship building, that's one of our superpowers. Oh my goodness, we should be leading in terms of developing relationships. So we should be at the forefront of business development activities. We are about relationships. If we are positioned and if society has suggested we've developed an ability and a competency for relationship building, we should be part, if not leading, commercialization processes at universities. We should be, if we are market oriented, if we care about market needs and we are caregivers, we need to be part of the fuzzy front end of the innovation. That's our superpower. That's where we should play. Build upon that. So that market orientation, the relationship orientation, and then our ability or our competence for community building means we can hopefully make more of an impact in terms of being more inclusive. So many companies want to access, to identify and have fresh approaches to find those underserved markets that serve the bottom line and the community as a mutually inclusive benefit as opposed to exclusive profit over planet or people. So I think those are ways, first and foremost, we have a level of competency. Society has suggested and have raised us over the past 50 years to be in those roles, in addition to, of course, our incredible ability to be both mathematicians and communicators. That's incredible hybrid gifts to have society suggest we should be translating or communicating complex information. That puts us in a very unique position to be those translators. How can we bring it to market? Of course, I'm being very general, I'm not saying that every female innovator is going to have those skills, but generally or societally, we have a lot of skills that have been valued at a slightly different percentage than those that are actually producing hard goods or products. And yet, at the end of the day, no organization, government, private sector has an organization if they are not serving a public, a person, a people, a market. And so if anything, we need to probably be more confident. We should be borrowing in terms of the confidence that's considered male, and it should be really a genderless construct. Confidence is one aspect to say completely genderless and innovative. So I have been running a few experiments with a psychometric instrument, looking at demographics and looking at self-reported innovativeness levels. Innovativeness is essentially your current state generally when you face a new idea. Are you the first to adopt a new idea? Are you one even to generate a new idea? And are you essentially potentially the last? And that essentially bell curve for the most part is called the technology adoption curve. So I have been running this experiment since my PhD, so over 10 years. And of course, I went down to see what are the gender skews? How do we see a societal norm surfacing? Do we see women who identify as women in the survey? So I have over 6,000 people in my database. Those 6,000 are very, very heterogeneous, very broadly represented in terms of senior executives, founders of startups, managers, master's students, and undergraduate students from a variety of different sectors. And so let me ask you, what do you think the results have suggested across this entire database and then perhaps in certain subsectors? What's your guess?
Carol, it's all you. I can see the wheels turning.
I was thinking about myself. I was like, where would I fall in those three categories? And I was like, I don't even know if I generate innovation. So I feel like that's probably where that landed in your experiment, where a lot of women were like, I don't think I generate much because of that self-deprecation that a lot of women experience. But maybe that's just me projecting. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd probably say something similar. I think a lot of women selling themselves short, which I think I've done before.
Well, the good news is they were on par and in certain sectors exceeded. So early adopter were actually a female on par with male, very close, and in certain sectors completely exceeded. And those that exceeded, the skew would be, I'd say, over 45 years of age, and also in senior leadership positions. Otherwise, we see parity, which to me is a resounding interesting insight. We self-report that we truly believe we see ourselves and not what the societal norms have suggested we might want to report. So that is fascinating, which is exactly where my next set of research is going to take me.
Were you, as the researcher, expecting that? Like, what were your initial thoughts going in?
I did not have a hypothesis because I have my own industry experience and perhaps perceived bias as a researcher, is that those individuals I have worked with, always a mix of genders throughout, but I always saw some of the most creative thinkers and problem solvers actually being the women in the room, even though there was always a small percentage. So I arrived at going, I'm curious what it's going to say, because my own, when I take this test, and these are not psychometric instruments that I've developed. These are 3 reliable, long-term, over 70 years of reliability and validity. And when I've taken it over and over again and tested it, my result, even if I try to game it, still results very similarly. And I was always very much the earliest adopter. I'm an inventor, I'm a maker. And it could be that in my community and those that I surround myself with, I saw that there were many. And so I thought we might perhaps be a little lower, but I was hoping for parity, but I was surprised when it exceeded. And some of my colleagues and co-researchers circled that and said, that is novel insight. No study yet has really been able to demonstrate that there is a statistically significant number that suggests we self-report differently than what currently the societal norms are suggesting. And that type of tension or potential dichotomy is rich terrain for more research.
I wish I answered differently now.
No, it was an honest and genuine answer. And by the way, most answer that way. You would be in the majority.
So we are going to wrap up, but I wanted to give you some space. Were there any things that you wanted to mention that we didn't touch upon? Things that you're excited about as your research continues?
Well, I think, Jeevan, you asked, what could we do different? The big question. And I certainly will mention that, first of all, we need to acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge that there is a disparity, and that to ideally reach parity would be incredible. But even to put policies, practices in place is a very positive step. Too many, let's say, mass orientation in terms of innovation is not going to result in innovation. It's going to be subpar. So we do need to have more diverse lived experience points of view at the table, in a room. I think this is our time to, especially as we are elbows up, Canadian proud, is how can we, and the government, the federal government and provincial governments throughout Canada are suggesting that, of course, they see, and the science suggests and the data supports, that more women in the innovation ecosystem at large will benefit our nation, will benefit societies, will benefit underserved communities. What can we all do about that? We can talk about it, which is fabulous. This is a great step. We can encourage more young women, especially undergrads, as they come in, to explore what entrepreneurship means and not present them a male-oriented point of view. And even someone like me who teaches and studies entrepreneurship education, I'm trying to make it gender neutral. Even the terminology use is very masculine. And so I'm very, very aware, and then I'm training others to be very aware of gender neutral terms and approaches to entrepreneurship and innovation. So I think we need to be part of a growing ecosystem. Let's give ourselves all permission to be a little, perhaps louder, ask lots of questions, continue our curiosity as to who's missing in this room and or in this process or project, and support each other along the way.
That is a really lovely note to end off on. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time. It was been lovely chatting with you.
It's been great. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
So, what did you think, Jeevan? Is innovation gendered?
I think so. I mean, I'd go so far as to say most things have been gendered. And I think the idea that problem solving or coming up with creative solutions is an inherently male trait it's a little ridiculous to me. But it's crazy how much that's entrenched in our society. What are you thinking about?
What's that phrase when someone says something really well that you were going to say? Better words.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Because women are the OG entrepreneurs. Mothers, wives, sisters, all project managers, icons. That's all I have to say.
We're resourceful people, very resourceful people.
Full stop. Anyway, thanks everyone for listening. Make sure you catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're feeling your feels, please drop us a review. You can find me on Blue Sky at Carol Eugene Park.
And me on Twitter at Jeevan K. Sangha. From Here Forward is an alumni UBC podcast produced by Kylie McFedrin for Podium Podcast Company.